So Battle of Allatoona Pass, because of its position, is a fairly obscure battle. Sherman had already taken Atlanta. I don't know that you can really call it part of Sherman's Atlanta campaign. It wasn't part of the March to the Sea. It happened long before that. So maybe the Tennessee campaign, I guess. I don't know that it had terrific strategic importance other than the fact it made Hood's march northward to interrupt Sherman's supply lines. It made it more difficult for him to be able to do that. So we're going to talk about Allatoona Pass today, and this is probably 35, 40 minutes, so I won't be going on forever up here. You ever get a speaker, you know, they're into their third hour?
It's pitiful. I don't like to think people do that.
So I'm not going to be doing anything like that.
Ye grew without sin cast the first stone.
Yeah. I'm just holding it.
I know.
Happened on October 5th, 1864, long after Sherman had occupied Atlanta. Union had 142 killed, 352 wounded, 212 missing. Confederates had 127 killed, 456 wounded, and 290 missing. You'll see it later in the discussion, but those figures are 33% casualties on both sides. Can you imagine today there being a battle that U.S. forces are in where they have 33% casualties?
Wow, yeah.
There'd be congressional investigations, and college campuses would erupt, and it would be terrible. So you can call this a forgotten battle of Sherman's Atlanta campaign if you want, but we've already kind of been through there. And let's see if I can figure out the, look at that. So here's Allatoona Pass. So during the marches, or during the Atlanta campaign, Sherman came down here, came through Cartersville, and he had been an engineer in this area before the war. So he knew all about the geography in Allatoona Pass. And he said, no way am I going to try to take an army through there. So instead of going through Allatoona Pass, he comes all the way down here to Dallas, and then that whole series of fights, Dallas, New Hope Church, Pickett's Mill, and then finally he ends up over in NACWRT and Kennesaw. That's why all those battles happen. And a lot of people scratch their heads during the Atlanta campaign. Well, what was he doing way down there in Dallas? Well, that's why. Because he was trying to avoid coming through Allatoona Pass. So what was the big deal about Allatoona Pass? And why would you not want to go through this? But first we'll start out and we'll look at the, well, I call them the antagonists. Who were the brigadier generals and above on both sides who fought in this contest? And another reason, this is a little obscure, we're not talking Grant versus Lee here. We're not talking Sherman versus Johnson here. We're talking about a bunch of people. Now, you guys have probably heard of them all, but your average person, Sears? You mean Sears and Roebuck? They fought in the war? I mean, Corse? John Corse, was he a Corse guy? Yeah, he probably was. But most people haven't heard of these. So it's an interesting group of people. So there's the first one, John Corse. Fought at the Battle of Island number 10, Corinth, and Vicksburg. Most of these guys came from the west. Most of them fought under William Tecumseh Sherman. As you're probably aware, when Sherman started the March to the Sea, he took about half of his army and he sent the other half north after Hood. And the people that he kept with him were the ones that had fought with him in the west, in Vicksburg and whatnot, because he knew them. So John Corse was promoted to Brigadier General for his service in Vicksburg. He's injured at the Battle of Missionary Ridge at Chattanooga. He was also injured at Allatoona Pass, which he successfully defended on October 5th, 1864. Sam French served in the Army of Tennessee under Joe Johnston and then John Bell Hood during Sherman's Atlanta campaign. On October 5th, 1864, French attacked the strongly held position at Allatoona Pass and retreated after several unsuccessful assaults on the fort there. And the thing that's kind of nice about it is Samuel French wrote a book about his experiences in the Mexican War and the Civil War, the war between the states. And he had a whole chapter on Allatoona Pass, and he had a really nice map in there, which I've stolen, but we're okay because it's out of copyright, which I've stolen for this presentation. French continued to serve under John Bell Hood in his Franklin-Nashville campaign and finished his Civil War career commanding Confederate forces in Mobile, Alabama. So those are the two big ones. John E. Tortolot was not the highest ranking officer in the fight, but he had the coolest name. Lieutenant Colonel John Tortolot fought under Ulysses Grant at the siege of Vicksburg and under Sherman during the March to the Sea. He's most famous for his commanding of 890 plus troops of the 4th Minnesota Volunteer Infantry at the Battle of Allatoona Pass on October 5th, 1864. And we'll get to more on that in a moment. He was brevetted a colonel in 1867 for meritorious services in the Battle of Bentonville, North Carolina. And most of you probably know what brevetted means, but in case you don't, it means it's kind of a temporary kicking up the ladders. It's not meant to be permanent. It's meant to show you're a great guy and we want to pat you on the back for it. And by the way, this is going to go away sometime. That's probably not the West Point definition. Brigadier General William Young served at Shiloh, Perryville, Murfreesboro, and was wounded at Chickamauga. Started serving under French during the Atlanta campaign. He was wounded at the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. Promoted to Brigadier General on August 15, 1864. So he wasn't a brigade commander until just a couple months before Allatoona Pass. He's injured at least 6 times in battle, the last at the Battle of Allatoona Pass. Captured during the battle, Young spent the next 4 months in federal hospitals. That must have been fun. February 1865, he was imprisoned at Johnson's Island and released on July 25th, 1865. And he lived to 1901. Brigadier General Francis Marion Cockrell, which I think you'll agree is a cool name also.
Oh, yeah.
Fought in the trenches during the siege of Vicksburg, where he was injured by the explosion of a mine. He was captured and eventually paroled. Fought at Carthage, Corinth, Wilson's Creek, and Elkhorn Tavern. And this is all West, fighting in the West. You mentioned that, you know, I know a lot about the Civil War in Georgia, and thank you. I like to think I know something about it. But my focus has always been the war in the West. So I've never given a presentation on Antietam. I've never given one on Gettysburg. And not that I don't think they're important, but they were in the West. I love Bruce Catton.
Yep.
But read Bruce Catton. How often does he talk about the war in the West?
Not very often.
Antietam, Gettysburg.
Race goes south.
So I know I can't go head to head with Bruce Catton, but this is my little bit for talking about the South. During the Atlanta campaign, Cockrell and his men were cited for their part in the Battle of Lost Mountain by Major General Sam French. He distinguished himself in fighting at Jonesboro. The Battle of Allatoona Pass, Cockrell, by then a brigade commander, launched assaults on Rowett Redoubt and the Star Point. We can argue until tomorrow, is it a Rowett or Rowett? I've heard it both ways from people who know, and so I have no opinion. Battle of Franklin in Tennessee under John Bell Hood, he was seriously wounded. He was captured outside of Mobile on April 9th, 1865, and imprisoned at Fort Gaines, which probably would not be a lot of fun if you've ever been to Fort Gaines. He was paroled in late May 1865. Brigadier General Claudius Sears fought at the Battle of Chickasaw Bayou, Fort Pemberton, Port Gibson, again, all in the west. Captured at Vicksburg, eventually paroled. Fought under Sam French during the Atlanta campaign and was struck ill during the battles for Atlanta. At Allatoona Pass, his brigade tried to attack the eastern redoubt from the north and east. He quickly became bogged down in the steep terrain on the east side of the pass. His assaults were unsuccessful. He continued to fight in Hood's army at Franklin, Murfreesboro, and Nashville, where he was wounded and captured by the Federals. He was released shortly after the war. So, that's the antagonists. That's the people that were fighting each other. So I think you'll agree that, you know, like I said, this isn't Lee versus Grant or Sherman versus Johnson. These are fairly secondary figures. So Allatoona Pass, what was so special about it? There's a wonderful engraving of Allatoona Pass. That's what was so special about it. And Sherman knew there were forts on both sides. And he wasn't going to be dumb enough to march his army through the middle of that when they could fire down on him. So that's why he made that big circle around it and went all the way down to Dallas. So it was a Western Atlantic Railroad that went through it. Sherman had pretty much captured the Western Atlantic by the time he got to Atlanta. It was his head supply chain. And, well, first off, that's the way they named railroads back then. The Western and Atlantic. It was a north-south railroad. Never got anywhere near the Atlantic Ocean and didn't go to the west because it was a north-south railroad. But still, it was a Western and Atlantic. There was a small town there, a Union supply center, railroad depot. There were some big warehouses there. Protected by two forts, each about 75 feet in diameter, on the top of the hills on the opposite side of the railroad cut. And when French attacked, the Union had control of those forts. There are some pictures from the war. This house is still there. This building is still there. It was a store. But this is not there. It was destroyed during the war. But you can see the pass going through here. And this picture is looking at it from the other end, and the two things I just pointed out to you, the house and the store, are visible in that picture also. So Sherman took Atlanta on September 2nd, 1864. Retreating Confederate Commander John Bell Hood decided to move his troops to the north towards Chattanooga. And he hoped to disrupt Sherman's supply line on the W&N. He helped to invade Tennessee, which he did. And he wanted to force Sherman to backtrack on his North Georgia gains. So if he could get Sherman out of Atlanta, because Sherman was going to chase him, he was all for that. The Union had a pretty good general commanding 55,000 troops chasing him, though. Sherman knew of his plans from news accounts of a Jefferson Davis speech. So he read it in the newspaper. Oh, that's what Hood's going to do. Well, I know what I'll do. I'll send 55,000 men up there, which was only half of his forces. See, when you have an overwhelming resource advantage over your enemy, you can do stuff like that. Oh, I'll send 55,000 men up there, and I'll take 60,000 with me to Savannah. And that's what Sherman did. October 1st to 3rd, 1864, Hood's forces tear up 15 miles of track near NACWRT and Big Shanty. Sherman sends Brigadier General John Corse to defend Rome. That's where we live. So that's good. Wanted to defend Rome. Sherman marches 55,000 towards Marietta. Huge force. But sets the stage to Braxton Bragg. He sends this message, and you'll notice in the Major General French is moving to attack Allatoona. Sherman's army appears to be moving out of Atlanta to meet us. Half of Sherman's army is moving out of Atlanta to meet him, not the whole thing. October 4th, Sherman learns that 2,000 troops under Confederate General Sam French are headed towards Allatoona Pass. In reality, it was 3,200. Sherman sends course from Rome to Allatoona, via the Western Atlantic. So here's something that was new in the war between the states, is getting troops from one place to another by railroad in a really quick time. And I just happen to have a book on that for a mere $10. But this is one of those instances where, of course, packed 1,000 men into a train, and they arrived at Allatoona Pass October 5th, 1864 at 1 a.m. So he joined 890 men under Lieutenant Colonel John Tortolop. So now you have, the Union has about 2,000 men, but they're in those fantastic defensive positions up on top of the hills. And then you got French with 3,200. Not enough. I mean, I guess West Point, typically they used to say you need 4 times the amount of men to take an entrenched position. Well, this was an entrenched position like up in the clouds. So he had nowhere near enough. Battle opened early. From 7 to 8:30, the Confederates opened an 11-cannon barrage. How do we know so specifically? Because it was in French's book. French moves troops to the west, Young and Cockrell, and northeast. Sears of the forts, he's trying to surround them. But how do you surround something when you're looking up at it? It's hard. And French sends a surrender ultimatum to Corse. Now, Corse was kind of a high testosterone guy, and there's no way he was going to surrender just because Samuel French told him to. And his response, I'll do a paraphrase of it, and then I'll show you the actual response. The paraphrase of it was, here's Corse's reply. Your communication demanding surrender of my command, I acknowledge receipt of it. I will respectfully reply that we are prepared for the needless effusion of blood whenever it is agreeable to you. I'm very respectfully your obedient servant. Now, Corse claimed, or not French, claimed he never received this response. He just said the time ran out and then he attacked. They're both dead now. I don't know. So here's French's report. So rugged and abrupt were the hills that the troops could not be got into position at about 9 a.m. when I sent in the summons to surrender. The flag was met by a federal staff officer, and he was allowed 17 minutes to return with an answer. The time expired without any answer being received. So he claims he never got Corse's famous, I'm ready for the effusion of blood whenever you are. This is the map from French's book, and the color stuff is from me. So the red stuff are the Confederate troops, the 11 cannons that started out, and here's what we call the Star Fort up here with Corse, and here's what we call the Eastern Redoubt under Tortolop. And so you see he's trying to surround them. You got Young and Cockrell here. You got Sears here. And I should mention, because this is important, because you might decide to go to the site today. You could get there in 3 hours, 45 minutes. This is Lake Allatoona out here now. But back then, there was no Lake Allatoona. So that's how Sears was able to come around here and climb up the hill. And that's Rowet's redoubt there, which is where the early fighting was on that side. More on the battle. Big thing different back then about now is there were no trees. You know, now the whole thing's covered with trees, you can't see anything. But back then, there were no trees. Orlando Poe had them all cut down, because he said someday there's going to be a battle here, and I don't want the guys up in those forts not being able to see the enemy coming up. Brigadier General William H. Young and Brigadier General Francis M. Cockrell attacked from the west. There's fierce fighting at Rowlett's Redoubt. And yeah, you get into the questions. There's a lot of reasons why the North won in the second part of the war. Henry repeating rifles was one of them. It's 16-shot magazines. So they delayed the Confederate advance. The Confederates didn't have any repeating rifles. They had, you know, the old-fashioned and then 3 hours later, whereas the Union troops, and by the way, they bought them themselves, like, well, I don't know if it was from the Sears catalog, but they bought them themselves, and they could, you know, they were doing the John Wayne thing. Who's going to win? Rowlett's Redoubt overrun, 200 Federal survivors beat it to the Star Fort. And then Sears launches an attack on the Eastern Redoubt from the north, and you saw where he was on the map. From 11 to 12, the Confederates made 4 assaults on the Star Fort. All of them were repulsed. And the Star Fort's still there. You can climb up there. Any of you know Jim Tipton? He had some serious heart problems. And he was going to walk up that hill if it killed him. And seriously, if it killed him, because he could have had a heart attack. But he huffed and puffed up that hill. So proud of him. Now, this is another reason why French lost. He got a second report of a large Union force entering Big Shanty. Big Shanty's right down the road. There's a railroad connecting Big Shanty to Allatoona Pass. And what was that figure that people were throwing around? 55,000? If I was him, I'd be 12 to 3 concentrated rifle fire on the Star Fort from 3 sides. Corse is wounded in the face and collapses. Rowlett assumes command. And then Corse wakes up shortly after and resumes command. And there was a bit of a to-do about that. Because Corse was knocked unconscious. Rowlett takes command. Corse stands up. I'm in charge here. And it causes some difficulties in the Union line while that happened. And I'm not going to say it now, but when Sherman sees him later, Sherman isn't convinced that he was wounded at all. But I'll hold off. On the other side, this is still there too, the remains of the Eastern Redoubt. Confederate General Claudius Sears. We don't name kids Claudius anymore, do we? Failed to take the Eastern Redoubt. 80 Confederates were trapped in a gully, and they were captured after the battle. The gully's still there too. Reinforcements, canister brought from the Eastern Redoubt to the Star Fort across the cut on a wooden bridge. It wasn't really a wooden bridge. Take 2 trees, big trees, and chop them down, and they go, and they cross the cut. So you got 2 trees across the cut, and they were running back and forth with these 2 trees. Stuff you do in battle that, geez, you'd never do at home, but stuff you're willing to do in battle. Major fighting's over by 3. French orders a withdrawal. Before withdrawing, French ordered Union supplies to be torched, but the effort failed. They couldn't get their matches to light. Before withdrawing, ordered the stores to be burned at the depot. Parties were sent, but all efforts they could make failed to procure fire. The matches furnished would not ignite, and no fire could be procured. That's a nice way of putting it. The enemy's fire, concentrated to protect their stores, was heavy and incessant all the time. Why did French withdraw? Concerns that his men had been essentially 3 days without rest. Good reason. Reports that a large enemy force was drawing near from Big Shanty. It wasn't, but it was there. We'll get to that in a moment. Sherman was watching them through a glass on Kennesaw Mountain. And they were getting low on ammunition. I knew the enemy was in Big Shanty by 9. By noon, he could reach NACWRT and be within 2 miles of the road to which I was to reach New Hope Church. I knew General Stewart had been ordered to near Lost Mountain. My men had marched all day on the 3rd, worked all the night of the 4th, marched to Allatoona on the night of the 4th, had fought up to the afternoon of the 5th, and could they pass the 3rd day and night without rest or sleep? And well, you get the idea. I deemed it of more importance not to permit the enemy to cut my division off from the army. While French is retreating, he successfully captured a Union blockhouse 2 miles south of the pass. There's a sign there where the blockhouse was. Blockhouse isn't there anymore. As you can see, it was flooded by the impounded waters of Allatoona Dam. But that's the closest victory that French got. The pass is held, 30% casualties on both sides. Bloody battle. October 6th, French rejoins Hood's army near Dallas. November 15th, Sherman begins the march to the sea. And by now, Sherman's army is split in half. But it was so big, he had 60,000 men on the march to the sea. And who was going to stop him?
Joe Wheeler.
Yeah, well, Wheeler was in.
Yeah.
Wheeler had 10,000 men. Okay. Corse describes his injuries. So Sherman wants to know, how's Corse? What's the news? He heard Corse had been injured. I am short a cheekbone and one ear, but am able to whip all hell yet. My losses are very heavy. A force moving from Stylesboro and Kingston gives me some anxiety. Tell me where Sherman is. When Sherman saw Corse several days later, he commented, Corse, they came damn near missing you, didn't they? Which was the high point of the battle, from my point. Sherman was on Kennesaw Mountain. He attempted to follow the battle. It's 14 miles away. He could see smoke through binoculars. He could see signal flags. At one point, he sent a signal flag message that said something like, hold fast, we are coming. They weren't, but he told them to hold fast because he was coming. The northern press turned it into hold the fort, for I am coming. You know, like MacArthur during World War II, I shall return. And this was turned into a hymn, and I'm going to sing the hymn for you. There was a tree that was real tall, and the Union guys would climb up to the platform on the top of the tree, and they were doing the signal flag things to their commanding general from the top of the tree. So Sherman was keeping an eye on what was going on. Why Sherman didn't think that maybe he should, send a little help? I don't know. He sent a lot of help the next day. So this is hold the fort, and I'm going to do a verse or two. Because you're probably familiar with this song. No, I'll do it over there. If you have any hymnals in your church, they're oldish hymnals, maybe 1930s or 1940s. This was still there. Now, you're not going to see this in too many contemporary services today. Feel free to sing along if you want. You may think we have to listen to him sing now.
Greg just said
Oh, my compass, see the signal waving in the sky. Reinforcements now appearing, victory is nigh. Hold the fort, for I am coming, Jesus signal still. Wave the answer back to heaven, by thy grace we will. See the mighty host advancing, Satan leading all. Mighty ones around us falling, courage almost gone. Hold the fort, for I am coming, Jesus signal still. Wave the answer back to heaven, by thy grace we will. The guy who wrote that song is evangelist Philip Bliss, and he's right here.
better known as Pete does.
I mean, we used to go to a Presbyterian church in NACWRT, Georgia, and they had an old chapel and a new sanctuary. And the old chapel, the hymn books in there were all published in the 1930s, and they all had this song in there. And they had all those wonderful songs like Fanny Crosby and, you know, people like that, that you don't, again, you don't hear in contemporary services. Sam French wrote Two Wars, an autobiography of General Samuel G. French, about his experiences in the Mexican War and the Civil War. And this is kind of amusing, and he couldn't have done this during the war, but he could do it after the war. He blasted John Bell Hood for his orders regarding Allatoona Pass. Now, you saw what Allatoona Pass looked like in that engraving. That's what it really looks like. French said, if this cut be critically examined, it will be perceived that the order to fill it up, which is the orders that Hood gave him, in an hour or so, and then go on to the Ottawa Bridge, does not evince a profound knowledge of engineering. I mean, with modern earth-moving equipment, it would take days. Maybe if you had an atom bomb, the size of what we dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, you could fill it. Or some of those bunker buster bombs that the British were using on the dams. But this is the Civil War. There was nothing like that. And then another quote, gain possession of the supplies under all the environments is only a vague expression of a glittering generality and signifies nothing particular and is a mere platitude and nothing more. What was I to do with them? Bring them away? Remove them without a wagon? What about 600 wagons were required? So you got to admit, French is a hoot. Luckily it wasn't me giving the presentation, but I was at a presentation in Cumming, Georgia, and the speaker was talking about John Bell Hood. And he was just going on and on about the worst general in American history and how terrible he was, and he's why the South lost the war, and on and on and on. Finally, a guy stood up in the middle of the crowd, and there was 30, 40 people there. I mean, there was a lot of people there. And he said, me and everyone around me are direct descendants of John Bell Hood. Oops. And I'm thinking to myself, boy, am I glad I wasn't giving this presentation. And so now I ask people, if I'm going to comment on John Bell Hood, I ask, anybody here directly related to? Or another of my favorites is, any of you directly related to Henry Sibley? Now, I had a guy once who said, yes, I was directly descended from Henry Sibley. And I think he was an awful general, too. So that was, Henry Sibley is where we get the expression "fell off the wagon" from. Because he got so drunk during the battles in New Mexico that he'd sit on the back of a buckboard and he'd fall off because he was so drunk. Anyway, so the battlefield today, the forts and the railroad pass are open to the public. The railroad cut is 180 feet deep, so think of that a moment.
Wow.
And about 360 feet long. And it doesn't, when you're looking at this picture, the pass hasn't started. If you can see that white sign that's up there, it's after that that the pass starts. Picture taken from the same perspective. Once again, you can see Clayton Mooney House here is still there. It was used as a hospital during the war.
It says renovated or modified.
Is it occupied or is it a museum?
No, it's occupied.
Is it?
There's the Clayton Mooney House. That's in their front lawn, which is cool. There is a monument grove that, I don't know, it's a half circle, so there's maybe 8 or 9 monuments. And then that's the railroad cut, but looking in the opposite direction. The unknown hero grave is 200 yards south. Confederate soldiers' grave maintained by railroad workers. Isn't that cool?
Wow.
The grave was moved in 1944 when the railroad cut was abandoned. They were afraid it was going to flood. So now it's, 200 yards south, and you can go and see the unknown hero. He showed up several days after the battle on a freight car. And they unloaded it, and inside was a Confederate soldier, but no information about who he was or even where he died. So we don't know that he died or was killed at Allatoona Pass, but his grave is still maintained. The original site of the unknown soldier, the unknown hero, is marked within the pass with that sign. And that's me significantly younger, and note also significantly thinner.
Where were you standing there in one of those forts?
That is actually at my home at the time,
No, really?
which is in the general area.
Oh, no, thing, it looked like a dugout.
But it looks like it could be at the fort. So, fini means I'm done bloviating. So, questions, comments, rebuttals?